So I'm going to talk about retention and cohort analysis. My name is Bei Lu. I'm from a company called Smule. It's a world-leading music creation platform. My role is Senior Director of Analytics and Decision Science. So basically, I use data to drive actionable insights to help people make informed decisions. So why are we talking about retention and cohort analysis together? Because they usually work together. Retention is the goal, and cohort analysis is the tool to help us understand retention and identify opportunities to improve retention. So here's what I'm going to share today. Because they're go together, so I wanted to talk more. Today's presentation basically would be somewhat operational and tactical. The goal is to help you to use whatever you heard here to help your business grow. So how can cohort, first of all, I wanted to share how can cohort analysis help you grow your business. There are a lot of applications for cohort analysis. I wanted to talk about three things specifically. Number one is how cohort analysis can help you understand your retention situation. Secondly, the other application is help you estimate lifetime value of your customers. Thirdly, optimize your marketing, product, and user experience. And also I wanted to give you some examples, very detailed step-by-step example to show you how cohort analysis can be done. And then lastly, critical steps that you need to bear in mind when you wanted to derive insightful cohort analysis for your startup. So that's what we're going to talk about today. First of all, I wanted to talk about why retention is important, right? Because I mentioned the retention is the goal. So why it's the goal? Because for startup companies, it's critical to build a growing user base. You wanted to see year over year, month over month, customer growth or revenue growth. So let's just imagine you just acquired 1 million active users in June. Great, congratulations. This is a great milestone. And you are also still very aggressively acquiring new users. So let's say in July, you acquired another 500K users. So at the end of July, you wanted to see your month-over-month growth, July over June. However, instead of having 1.5 million active users, what you find is you only had 800K active users. So you are not growing, even though you successfully acquired a lot of users. So what's the problem here? What's going on here? So I call this problem the leaky bucket problem. As you can see, right? You spent money and you put 500K new users into your active customer base. However, at the same time, you have a leaky bucket problem. You are not able to keep the 1 million active users you acquired from June. So in July, apparently 700,000 of your June acquired user has already turned inactive. That's why net at the end of July, you only had 800K users. So how do we fix this leaky bucket problem? To fix it, first of all, you need to be able to measure that. So let me do the player view again. Sorry. Yes. How do you measure your retention rate, right? How do you effectively understand your funnel? How many you got and how many leak out? How do you manage that whole process? So The KPI to measure user retention is user retention rate. So we just talk about your June, July customer acquisition activities. So how do you calculate user retention rate? So what happened is in June, which is the previous time period, you acquired 1 million active users. And then at the end of July, you find you have 800K active users. And during the month of July, you acquired another 500K. So actually your retention rate for June users is about 30%. Basically, you use number of active users at the end of July, which is 800K, minus how many you acquired, 500K, that's 300K, and your base, at the end of June, you have 1 million. So the user retention rate, active user retention rate, is about 30%. Now, is it a good number or a bad number? Usually you want it as higher as possible, right? 30% month over month active user retention rate actually is considered to be low. So you need work to do to improve that. Because retention rate is calculated based on time period. So this time period can be month, can be day, or a year, depending on industry. For mobile industry and gaming industry, usually retention rate is measured looking at daily activity. For example, day 2 retention is a critical KPI for those industries. For e-commerce and the finance industry, usually monthly retention is those companies are looking at. So based on your business model, you need to decide, do you want to look at short-term retention like D2 retention, D7 retention versus monthly retention. So at Smule, we look at D2 retention like a hawk. We basically measure every day we look at D2 retention because it's hugely important for us. Our analysis actually showed D2 retention is highly correlated with long-term retention. If your user do not come back on the second day, the chance of their coming back is much lower later. So to measure retention rate effectively, that's where cohort analysis would come in. You have to measure retention rate by cohort. Why I say that? So first of all, let's look at what is cohort and cohort analysis. So basically, I got this definition from the internet. There is a book called The Lean Analytics, Use Data to Build Better Startup Companies. I think this definition is pretty good. So cohort basically is a group of users. So for example, graduation class is a cohort, right? They share common characteristics. Graduation class let's just say 2016, meaning this group of users all graduate in 2016. For business, of course, it's different, right? Basically, you need to have a starting point. And I'm going to tell you how this can be built and done in the later slide. But one thing that I wanted to emphasize is cohort analysis, again, is a tool to help you measure user retention. And also, it is part of user lifecycle management. That's why we look at cohort view instead of group everybody together. And then also it is important, this is a basic user segmentation. You all probably heard about the term segmentation, right? You can segment user in different ways. For example, by geographical area, US user versus international user. Cohort analysis is also a basic user segmentation way of segment your user base. And it is a very, very basic, fundamental way of doing that. So if we wanted to do cohort analysis, one important thing is to define your cohort first. You cannot do cohort analysis without define it, clearly define it. Usually, for industry, the first time a user establishes a meaningful relationship with you or become the so-called active user is when the cohort starts. There are basically two types of cohort. You can base that. It's critical to based on your business model. What is important to you? There are typically two ways you can define a cohort. One is engagement based. For mobile app and gaming, usually it could be download. The point when a user download your app, they can be the cohort. Like user download your app in June 2016, then they should be the June 2016 cohort. Or you can use install. The challenge of use download is usually you cannot track download number. You have to get download number from tools like App Annie, Flurry. But the challenge is you don't know who download your app. Versus install, you have technical ways you can track what user actually install your app. So at Smule, we typically use install as a starting point to look at user cohort. And then for e-commerce and the finance industry, it is the first transaction. It could be registration or registration plus engagement. For monetization-based cohort, usually it happens on the first transaction. So it's a little bit different, right? When you say cohort, for e-commerce business, you don't usually just look at, for e-commerce business, you look at registration. But if your goal is really monetization, then you cannot just look at when those users become active user. You have to also look at when they first purchase from you. So that difference is very, very important. I'm going to tell applications of this in later slides. That's why this is important. So you can name your cohort based on the timing when the meaningful relationship happens. So now I wanted to talk about some application of the cohort analysis. Of course, the first one is cohort analysis help us understand what is your user retention rate. As we mentioned before, there is a leaky bucket problem, right? So don't you want to understand how much percentage of the user you acquired last month or 2 months ago or 3 months ago, how much are still active at this time point? So that's the user retention curve tells you. And you have to do it by cohort. You cannot just group them together. So let me explain this chart a little bit. So the x-axis is number of months. This is a time period. And I wanted to point out that this time period, this month, is normalized month. It's not calendar month. So 1 here doesn't mean January. 1 here means the first month those users establish a relationship with you. So in this case, if you acquire 1 million active users in June, June will be first month for the June 2016 cohort. For July 2016 cohort, July 2016 will be the first month. So this is a normalized window. That's the x-axis. The y-axis actually is percentage of users that's still active. So for example, if we look at this blue line here, this is cohort 1. As we can see, of course, month 1 is 100%, because that's when they first come in. Month 2, if you look at the blue line, it's 60%. That means 40% of the 1 million users you acquired stop coming to your product or your company or your app, whatever it is. So you are losing them. And you don't usually want it to see too much degradation. That's a way to help you track. And also the other thing I wanted to point out is, sorry, go ahead. That's a very great question. I have some details down the road. I'll show you how to do that. Very good question. Yeah, so you actually touched a very critical point here is cohort analysis not only help you measure what has happened, more importantly, it should serve a tool to help you understand what makes things different, right? As you point out, cohort 2 is different. So I'm going to talk about that very soon. So the first application is understand retention curve. As I said, retention is critical. Now, the second application is user lifetime value. This is also something startup companies usually face, right? You wanted to forecast your revenue growth. Forecast your revenue growth based on your user base growth, right? How do you do that? So first of all, you need to define what is lifetime value. What's lifetime for your customers base, right? It could be different companies have different definitions. It could be 12 months, it could be 36 months, and it could be 48 months or 5 years. For example, some well-established companies like telecommunication companies, they have longer user lifetime. So it all depends on your business. So how can you, based on cohort analysis, retention curve, to estimate how much your revenue would be and to show your progress, right? In this case, there are 2 cohorts. The earliest cohort is July 13. It is matured as a lifetime, 36 months. Let's just assume this is for 36-month lifetime. And then if you look at the more recent cohort, April 16, you can see the y-axis actually indicate April 2016 cohort has better revenue retention, which is wonderful. That means you're doing something right. So again, the x-axis is time window. In this case, is normalized time window. M1 meaning the end of the time period after initial purchase, in this case. The cohort is based on first purchase date. Why it's first purchase date is not first install date? Do you have any thoughts about that in this case? Anybody have any thoughts on why, compared to the previous slide, this is user retention curve. So the y-axis is normalized time about when user first become your active user, versus this one, what I said here is month since first purchase, because this is a fundamental difference, right? When you, sorry. Exactly. That's a very good answer for mobile or gaming industry, right? You can, oh, sorry, I forgot to repeat. Basically, the answer here is when you download a mobile app, it's free, right? So there is no monetization. Only when you spend money to purchase or subscribe, you incur revenue. That's why when you estimate lifetime value, usually it's good to start when user first spent money with you. That's a very good answer. That's why this is a fundamental difference here. So the y-axis now is different. Instead of percentage user who are still active after X month, now this is revenue per user as a percentage of previous month. So let me explain that. So assume your transaction is $1, right? The initial transaction is $1. At the end of the month, not everyone of your original purchasers or subscribers or whatever it is who spent money with you, not everybody will do a second transaction, right? So at the end of the month, this is a hypothetical number, but at the end of the month, only 65 people out of your original 100 people who spent money with you again. So now the value from $1 now becomes 65 cents for month one at the end of the first month. And at the second month, you have less people. Usually the curve is, this is a cumulative curve of spending money. But usually at month two, out of the original 100 people, only probably 70, month one is 65 people spent money. And then at month two, only 75% of the 65% continue spending money. So your value for month two is 49 cents now. And you keep based on what this curve tells you, you can estimate how much percentage of revenue will still be remaining for your older cohort. And you can calculate and estimate total value for 36 months this way.
So how many months are you doing in order? Because especially if in the second month you have a higher drop-off, how are you figuring out like what the formula is in month 28? Are you assuming that it's basically just going to standard? Very similar to kind of the month previous, after that first drop-off?
Good question. So the question is, there are actually two questions in your question, if I'm not mistaken. The first question is, how do you know how many months you should look, right? In other words, how do you define your lifetime? That's the first question. Second question is, how do you estimate this curve, right? How do you know every month how much percentage your revenue will be remaining to calculate lifetime value? So first of all, as I said, define lifetime is the first thing you need to do. So generally speaking, 36 months is most people are using. Some companies use 12 months because for simplicity's sake, right? Because it is really hard to estimate revenue to manage user life cycle for 36 months or even longer. So that's why a lot of companies wanted to be simple, 12 months. For my opinion, 12 months is just too short. Sorry. Oh, okay. Okay. So to answer your second question, how do you know the percentage here to apply to newer cohort? You don't know their revenue retention rate, right? So there are two ways to do that. The first way, if your company has a history, right? Ideally have 3 years history, then you know July 13, you already have a couple cohorts that's matured for lifetime. So you can assume, in this case, look, the curve actually is kind of stable at month 6. You pretty much hit 90% of revenue remaining to the previous month. So if you have historical data, then you can, based on historical data for matured cohorts, you can estimate that way. Now the question is, my company is so new, I don't have historical data, so what do I do, right? So there is any, then you have to make some judgment call if there's no historical data, right? You at least have couple months history, then you can use those couple months history to estimate what will happen in the next 2 to 3 months. And I cannot say this is the truth, but generally speaking, the trick is, based on my experience, the trick is usually after month 3 or month 6, your curve will plateau, depending on your business. So what you can do is do some sensitivity analysis, right? To say, hey, assume it's plateaued at 3 months versus 6 months, assume it's 90%, 85%. That will help you get an idea. And when you accumulate more data, you can adjust your estimate here. So the question is, why, please correct me if I didn't understand your question correctly. So what you are saying is why we look at lifetime value from a retention perspective. Why do not from a churn perspective? Because SaaS company usually use churn, right? They're the same, basically, very similar. Churn is the opposite of retention. So it's just a, opposite, the percentage, Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, the question is, the follow-up question is why it's 36? Are we trying to cap on the lifetime value? No. The reason is for companies like, most of the companies, 36, but you're right. For some of the companies, like SaaS company or telecom company, could be much longer, which is fine. As long as you know how long it is, you can use that number. But if you are a very new startup, you don't actually know what will happen, then the default or rule of thumb, something for simplicity's sake, you can use 36 months. Okay, now I'm going to go back to the question somebody was asking about how do we identify opportunities that will improve user retention or lifetime value, right? So in this case, going back to the user retention curve, we did see cohort 2 has higher retention. So what's going on here? What happened? The key to understand this is not only understand your user cohort, but you have to maintain a marketing or product release calendar. This is super important, right? You need to know when you want to run marketing campaign, you need to keep a record of at what time point I run what campaign and what is the estimated impact to user. And then this will help you understand the key factors that drive different cohort behavior. For example, if you look at cohort 2, at month 3, we see actually it has higher retention than the other cohorts. What could happen? For example, you may have run a marketing reactivation marketing campaign, right? Because you find your user you acquired last month, this month actually hasn't come back. Then you ran a reactivation campaign, and then they come back. You remind them to come back to your product. That's why your retention is better in this case. And usually, things like reactivation marketing campaign or push notification could be very effective tool to remind user who has already churned to come back. So that's the third application I wanted to talk about. Next, I wanted to say there are some details that you can follow to conduct effective cohort analysis to help you optimize marketing, product, and user experience so that you can grow your user base and revenue base. So there is a case study I wanted to talk about. So this case study is for a mobile app company. This mobile app company actually is growing very, very fast. Exponential growth, which is wonderful. And this company is also very much close to measuring their KPI. So they look at D2 retention every day, pretty much, to see previous days new user, after they acquire, do they come back? Because as I mentioned, day 2 retention is highly correlated with long-term retention. So this is a time series chart about D2 retention number. So the x-axis is calendar date, and you can also consider this as daily cohort. So for example, June 24 is June 24 cohort when they first install this mobile app. And don't worry about the number here. The 0 means everything is fine. According to some statistical algorithm, 0 means the change is within normal range. So the up and downs, it's kind of noisy, but don't worry about it. Everything is fine. 1 means good trend, upward trend, slow upward trend. -1 means slow downward trend. When you see slow downward trend, you need to pay attention now. Something may be there to cause your D2 retention coming down. But that is not, a fire drill. But in this case, if you notice, at the end of June, there is some red alert there. -3 means dramatic change. It's a shock to the system. You can see D2 retention just drop like a rock dramatically. This is very bad. So what's going on and how do we reverse this trend? So this is one type of cohort analysis. You have a question? Very good. So what his comment is Brazil, right? So I'll answer your question. Actually, very close, but not exactly the same answer. So this is basically a cohort analysis, time series cohort analysis based on observational data. You don't have tests here. So unfortunately, you cannot tell what's really going on, right? Because you don't have A/B test. So you don't know what happened to the late June cohort versus earlier cohorts. This is observational data. So it's more challenging to analyze than A/B testing data. Sorry? Right. The question is D2 the second day? Yes. So industry standard is D1 is the first day user established relationship. D2 is the second day after they establish that relationship. Yes.
And your retention is them just going back to the app or making a purchase?
This is user retention in this case. Or you can apply this same methodology to monetization. Could be D2 of purchase, right? So in this case, you have to form some hypothesis first based on your business model, right? So how do you form hypothesis to understand what factors that actually cause this dramatic change? Usually, I'll come back to you. Usually, when you see this kind of dramatic change is something with product or user change flow. That's usually it. However, it could also relate it to marketing activities. Maybe you suddenly had a campaign that's not very successful. And user was not happy with the message you said to them. Therefore, the new user does not come back the second day. So the key is to form hypothesis based on your knowledge about your company's business. And I listed some usual suspects here, factors that you usually wanted to analyze when things like this happens, when key KPI show this kind of dramatic change. So of course, you cannot one size fits all. First of all, you may want to understand what's going on by geographical location, as you mentioned, Brazil, right? If your major customer base is US, then you should look at US number. If Brazil is a small proportion of your user base, then probably Brazil change is not important because it's not gonna impact overall metrics. That's why I say having a marketing and a product calendar is super important because you wanted to understand what happened at the end of June, what marketing campaign you did, and also your product releases. As I said, dramatic change usually related to new product releases, change in user flow and experience. But in this case, the interesting thing is the analysis looking at key factors actually identify the culprit is the back-end platform. As I mentioned, this company has been growing very, very fast. So they have networking capability bottleneck. And it's finally to the point that they cannot handle the network traffic from countries that typically has very slow network connection. And those countries are the fastest growing market for this company. Therefore, you see a dramatic drop. So the action item in this case is to serve, download, and content in the data center that is close to those geographical locations to mitigate and, of course, expand network capacity. So this is an example. Any questions before I go to the last session, which is the... Okay, another great question. So when the question is when user churn and then come back, will they fall into the previous cohort or fall into a new cohort? The answer is either way is fine, depending on what makes the most sense for your business. You can consider them as the old cohort. You can also consider them as new cohort. Now, the advantage of them put back into the, keep them in the old cohort is you can measure your reactivation campaign effect. However, for monetization measurement, like lifetime value, the suggestion is to keep them in the new cohort. Because if you have them remain in the cohort, your ROI for your new acquisition campaign will look worse than it actually is, right? Because if you have them remain in the old cohort, the revenue will be attributed to your new spending. For example, you spend money to reacquire a user, to reactivate a user, yet the user cohort is the old cohort. So you are actually underestimate the ROI and effectiveness of your acquisition or marketing campaign. So that's why the rule of thumb is for user retention, either way, probably better to have them remain in the old cohort. But for monetization, especially when you want to measure effectiveness of marketing campaign, you should probably put them in the new cohort. It's simple. Otherwise, you will be confused. Yeah, I had this issue before, and it makes acquisition spend decision-making really tough. You don't want to do that. Okay, so the last part, since we have talked about the application and example, so how does this relate to you? What can you do to do effective cohort analysis? There are a couple critical steps I really want to mention. First of all, you need to define the right KPI to monitor, right? You want user retention, or you want revenue retention, or you want buyer retention. The definition decides how you measure them. And then, do you want short-term retention or longer-term retention, right? You need to strike a balance. You need to look at short-term retention because it may enable you to act faster. You don't have to wait like 7 days to know, hey, the second day retention dropped. There's something wrong with your first-time user experience you need to fix, right? Versus if you wait 5 weeks to see long-term retention, you miss the opportunity window, the optimal window to fix user experience. However, you cannot just stop at D2 retention because you need to track user for lifetime cycle management. So you need long-term retention as well. So it's a balance to strike. But first of all, you need to define KPI. You cannot change ideas on a daily basis. That way, you cannot effectively track. Secondly, you need to track and collect user-level data. In order to measure retention and conduct cohort analysis, you need to know who are your customers, who are your users. So there are tools out there, Google Analytics, And Flurry and App Annie, those tools can tell you high-level KPIs. To do a good analysis, to make your company successful in the long term, I highly encourage you develop a mechanism to track your user, to identify your user identification. It is very difficult, right? You can use account ID. When user register, you can use account ID to identify who the user is. However, the challenge is the same user, me, you can create multiple account IDs. But at the end of the day, you are the same person. So this is actually a challenge for a lot of companies, even for very established companies. For web business, usually cookie, but we all know the limitation of cookie, digital fingerprint, like the device ID of your device, mobile IDFA, also device ID, but they all have limitations. And the email address, you know, people can create fake email address and then get it verified. So email verification is not the silver bullet. The best way to track is user's phone number, but not many people would love to provide a phone number. So there is a balance to strike. In the registration process, if you ask people to provide too much information, you will turn them away, right? It's not easy enough for them. They feel like you are trying to get information out of them, but you have to keep certain level of information so you can identify who the user is. And then, of course, you need to have user behavior data for you to understand whether they're still purchased, whether they're still active users. So have solid data is the foundation for accurate measurement and track. And thirdly is the optimization part, right? Once you have the data, you wanted to do analysis to understand user behavior. As I mentioned, one critical first step is form hypothesis based on your business knowledge to help you understand what's going on with a trend. To understand the what is very important, like what is your customer retention curve look like, right? But to have your business grow, the real value is in why something happened, why cohort 2 performs better, right? And how can I, based on my learning for cohort 2, how can I make other cohorts have better retention? How can I optimize? That's the key thing. So the first thing is form hypothesis. The next, there are multiple cohort analysis you can do, right? The example, the case study I talked about is based on observational data and based on your marketing and product calendar, you can understand, you can figure out what's going on. There is another more sophisticated type of analysis you can do for understanding cohort behavior and retention behavior, which is using more sophisticated predictive modeling or using classification algorithm to tell you what kind of user behavior are more important or what kind of product features are actually important to drive higher retention rate. So that's the actionable insights piece. Third step, now the last step, test your way for optimization. You don't know until you test it to see actually it works or not, right? You can have a hypothesis and you can use historical data to validate your hypothesis. But for future, nobody can tell the future. The only way to tell you whether whatever you try to do will work or not is to do test, A/B test, and learn fast, fail fast, and success fast. So that's all I have today. If you have a question, I'm happy to answer. The question is template for those analysis. Yeah, we do have templates. Yeah, that's a very good question. We do have templates. You do need templates, so you can do repeatable measurement, consistent and repeatable measurement. But in terms of what template is better than the other, it all depends on what you are doing, right? Because you mentioned it's too complicated, then you wanted to simplify it. I would say simplicity. There are core components for retention and cohort analysis. As long as the essence is there, you don't want to make it too complicated. I think we need to talk about details for me to more effectively answer your question. Sorry. Yeah. Keep it simple. That's important because remember, measurement is only the first step. Optimization is and the action is the key to grow your business. So do not spend too much time on measurement. The time should be spent on, based on the numbers, what can I do to improve the business? Sorry, we can follow up. Yeah. Anything else? Any other questions? No? Okay, thank you for your time.